Hello. Can you still hear me? All right. Hello, everyone. So what I want to tell you a bit about today is not specific per se about chocolate, but related to it. I run a lab at Wesleyan where we care about what makes us choose the things we do and how it leads to excessive problems of addiction-like types, whether it's for drugs, foods, or gambling. And so that's a bit about what I'm going to tell you today. I want to tell you a bit about how we understand and how we uncover our unconscious desires and how it can lead to our problematic relationship with food. Is that better? Yes. Sorry, my bad. So what we're interested in my lab is why we make certain decisions. What makes us choose certain types of food versus others, from the excessively healthy to the not so much chocolat. I've used that several times today. What I feel like we've all done is weigh the pros and cons of making a certain choice with regards to food, but what I don't think we normally make as an assumption is whether when we pick a certain type of food, we are picking it because we want it or whether we like it. And that may seem like maybe a strange question to ask, but the reason behind that is because to some degree, recent research has uncovered the fact that there is a dissociation between wanting and liking, that in essence they are not necessarily the same thing and are actually governed by different parts of the brain. And so what you're looking at here, if you can sort of somewhat see it, is pathways in the human brain that are responsible for, in green, wanting, and in red, liking. And what you should be able to notice from there is that those two are very related. They share a lot of areas in the brain and are closely linked to each other, which explains why typically we want what we like and we like what we want. But you might notice that, contrary to what you would expect, there's an awful lot more wanting in the brain than there is liking. And there might be a relatively straightforward evolutionary explanation to that, which is that if we weren't to experience pleasure from the foods that we ingested, but we wanted them, we would probably still survive. In contrast, if we were to just like them, but not want them, then we would actually starve. And such research has actually been carried out, and we can see in animals at least, that if we take out their ability to want food, they will starve themselves to death, even if the food is right in front of them. But if you give them that food, they would find it delicious, however mundane it might be if they're hungry enough. And that's some of the things that we're interested in. We want to try and understand how those two pathways work to generate our choices and motivated behaviors for food. But it's not just relevant to food. It seems that in some cases, wanting and liking can be dissociated. The most frequently known example is in drug addiction. But frankly, in many ways, that addiction, as you'll see from my talk, hopefully, is true for other forms, such as food and food addiction as a whole. The idea being that when we initially ingest a drug or food, we enjoy it, and that makes us want to have it more. But with repeated consumption of that drug, what we see is that typically the part of the brain that's involved in wanting it starts growing and starts showing more and more responses, and we start craving it to the point where we excessively want and overconsume of that certain type of reward. In contrast, surprisingly, liking seems to not really change. If anything, sometimes it develops what we call tolerance, which is that actually the individual needs to consume more of it to get the same pleasurable responses they did in the first place, which is quite contrary and sort of against what we normally expect with regards to how we make decisions. What is further interesting is that when you just focus on wanting, if you assume that it plays an important role, it actually itself comes into two further distinctions, which is that you can separate out a more cognitive form of wanting, that is what we'd call here cognitive plans, which are generally run by parts of the prefrontal cortex, an area of the brain that is relatively new compared to most older mammals or more ancient mammals. In contrast, and this cognitive plans are involved in making long-term goals, sticking to them, and making decisions that are best in our long-term interest rather than anything that might be immediate and in our best interest right now. In contrast, we have areas of the brain that we could call being responsible for this unconscious wanting or unconscious desire. And those are areas of the brain that are involved with sort of basic survival urges. Now, those urges are generally well used and have a good purpose because they make us eat when we're hungry, drink when we're thirsty, and so on and so forth. But when we live in a society where food is not lacking necessarily, and that we can get food when we're hungry, then you've got to wonder what those parts of the brain still do. They are crucial for the survival of most animals. But are they still important to us? And if they're not, what exactly are they doing for our behavior? And that's what we're sort of interested in here. These unconscious desires are run by subcortical structures, so areas that are below the newer cortex of the brain, right? And those two distinct forms of wanting come in the following cases. The cognitive plans that we make are the ones that tell us that we want to eat salad, either at dinner or generally, and keep a healthy diet. They are also what tells us, if you're still a student, have been a student, or have a student in your family, that we should study, that that's the best way to go forward, to progress, to have a successful life. Those are the cognitive plans that we set out to do. But they are often challenged by some more unconscious desires, such as eating food and chocolate. Yes?
Could you please speak up?
Hold the mic closer.
Sorry. Yes. I just don't want to. Much better. Okay. So, in contrast, some of those unconscious desires may be aspects of our choices that make us desire some of the things that might not be in our best interest in the long run, such as eating chocolate, which doesn't really have a survival need, but let's say is just very pleasant. Or it is ditching studying to go and spend time with our friends or just do anything else other than those long-term goals. There is, therefore, an input between those cognitive plans and those unconscious desires that constantly interplay between each other. We're trying to figure out how that interplay happens and how it may go awry in certain situations. In particular, we normally have our unconscious desires generate up to our cognitive plans and trying to interfere with them. So your urge to eat chocolate right now is trying to be kept in check by your plan to say 1 chocolate bar is enough per day. Probably doesn't keep the doctor away. One of the best examples that I can come up with of how this cognitive plan and unconscious desire battles it out on a regular basis is the Marshmallow Test. Now, some of you probably heard of this, but for those of you who haven't, the Marshmallow Test is essentially a study that was run by Walter Mischel in the 60s and 70s, where they took young preschool children and brought them into a testing room and gave them a choice. They said, I'll give you a marshmallow now, and if you can wait 15 minutes, you can get a second one. If you want, you can eat this one now, but you won't get the second one. And so for every single adult, that would normally be quite a relatively easy choice. But for a preschooler, that is a challenging task. The ability to hold back and to not consume that food right there and then is an internal struggle. And that internal struggle is between the cognitive plan of knowing that 2 is better than 1 and the unconscious urge of saying it's sitting in front of me, it's staring at me, it smells so good. Just like you might see in this young boy here. You can see how there is a struggle there. It is very obvious. And what you're watching at play is the ability to him to say, no, I shouldn't, but some kind of unconscious urge to nevertheless have to reach out, touch it, taste it, smell it. If you look at some of the videos of this, you actually watch other kids actually trying to lick it or try to take the inside of the marshmallow out so that the experimenter doesn't notice. Unbeknownst to them, they're being filmed the entire time. Now, it's not just a marshmallow thing. In this little case, you can see the beautiful arm of the cognitive unconscious desire on the one hand and the cognitive plan pulling it back at the same time. I frankly can't get enough of that kid. That should just be my entire talk, really. The question remains really is, why does that matter? Right? This is very cute, but does it actually have any relevance for what I'm telling you about and for science in general? And it seems to be that it does. The research followed those kids. Now, these ones are more recent, but the ones that they did the studies originally in the 60s and 70s, and followed those children and found that those who were most capable of withholding and waiting were the ones who had the best or better SAT scores, academic achievement, lower rate of divorce, lower rate of incarceration, and lower rates of obesity, for that matter. And I don't think that's a coincidence to some degree. What I'm arguing here is that what we have is that we're planning between our unconscious desires, and we need to understand what it is that triggers them. Because if we can understand what starts our unconscious desires, we've got a better chance of guarding ourselves against their evil intentions. And one of the things that tries to trigger our unconscious desires are cues. What do I mean by that? I mean stimuli that are everywhere around us that try to get us to think about food, whether intentionally or not. Now, hopefully, all of those evoke some kind of emotion to you in some way or form. And what I want you to notice is that most of them don't really have food in them. The golden arches it's just a very fancy M. But nonetheless, it should at least give you some kind of guttural reaction, which I'm hoping is more negative than positive, but at least you have a feeling towards it, right? So these cues and the presentation of them can trigger intense bouts of craving. And that craving is just the emergence of that unconscious desire. We typically see it from our response to the smell of freshly baked brownies or cookies, or even the smell of coffee brewing might make you want something. It doesn't change how much you appreciate it, like it, but it might initiate those urges. And what we've seen, and so this is part research that I've done in my lab, but also research that's been done in humans, we've seen that the individual's reaction and their brain reaction to cues that are related with food acts as a very good predictor of their later obesity rate and their BMI, their body mass index, how much weight they gain and how much they're willing to overeat when they get access to junk food. And so there seems to be some kind of deep-seated trace of what our intentionality towards certain foods is underlying how we respond to food-related cues. And so you might ask, why should we not just indulge, right? Maybe we are predisposed in some kind of way to respond to those cues. Is there really a reason to not just eat away and see what happens next? If indulging is a problem, in the short term, it's not so much of an issue. So as soon as you leave this theater after watching a movie all about chocolate, you can go and gorge on chocolate, and that should be fine. In the long run, it could be an issue. And I want to tell you a bit about why that might be the case. It seems that from our research, that exposure and consumption of desired rewards, such as chocolate, doesn't just impact your waistline. It actually impacts your brain and has some kind of lasting impact on your brain. What we know is that chocolate on the brain releases dopamine. And whether it's chocolate or any other kind of junk food, frankly, has the same sort of effect. If you look it up online, you'll find that there's images of the brain on food or on sugar versus the brain on cocaine, and they look very much the same. And that should be quite alarming. Now, assuming that sugar and cocaine are the same thing is probably an overreach, but there might be some similarities. And the way that we respond to those foods is similar to how our brain and our body responds to drugs of abuse. And that's where my interest lies. What we see is that that reaction is actually a spike and a change in dopamine function. Now, I'm assuming most of you have heard of dopamine before, in some way or form. Does anyone know what it does? Pleasure. Perfect, that's the answer I was hoping you were going to give me. It's not the right one, unfortunately. So if anything I can achieve tonight, it is hopefully to correct a wrong that has been perpetuated for longer than I've probably been alive almost, which is this belief that dopamine is involved in pleasure. And it was based on a finding that was done in the 60s and 70s, where they found that when animals consumed food or drugs or sex, they had increases in dopamine in their brain. And the assumption was, therefore, that that must be pleasure, because why would we do anything else if it wasn't for pleasure? It turns out that's not the case, that instead pleasure is not driven by dopamine, but that dopamine is very important for those behaviors and is more likely associated with the wanting of those behaviors than the actual pleasure or liking of it. Right? Now, does that mean that pleasure doesn't play a role in our overconsumption of anything, for that matter? Is it just there as sort of a garnish on top, literally the cherry on top of our life? Well, the surprising part about what we found in our research is that actually when you look at an individual's response, when we take animals that are predisposed to developing obesity, they actually have lower responses to sweet taste, lower pleasure responses to sweet taste. They don't seem to like things as much as the regular animal or the regular individual. Furthermore, if they are chronically exposed to junk food, that further blunts that response. If anything, that doesn't say that our overconsumption of food is driven by pleasure, but instead, this is something that's more akin to what we see in drugs, that on the one hand, the pleasure goes down, And that might be a driver, but what is really driving the overconsumption is how much we want that food. And so what might be the case is that dopamine is instead triggering wanting, a form of subcortical urge to overconsume. Now, we know that what it does is that it triggers desires for food and its cues. So we start becoming more attracted to anything that's related to food, especially high-fat, high-sugar foods. And that can be problematic, but especially in the long run. The problem comes where repeated consumption of these foods actually changes how that system works. It sensitizes it, by that meaning it makes it hyper-responsive or hypersensitive to the food and cues and makes them craved even more. And we go from the wanting that is survival-based to the wanting that is overconsumption-based and somewhat problematic. And so, back to our initial graphic, what happens when we turn from the regular healthy wanting to the unconscious excessive desire? Well, unsurprisingly, what happens is that your unconscious desires start taking over, and the long-term goals and plans seem to recess into the background and take less and less of a role in influencing your decisions and your life. And you could see how that might be the case for drug addiction. And more people are making the argument that in obesity and overconsumption, that's what we see also. And so what the result is from all that is that as we overconsume junk foods, which is a very easy thing to do, and as we overconsume chocolate, which is even easier around Easter and most times of the year, frankly, it promotes craving and overconsumption, and it actually changes the way our brain is wired. Some of our research has shown that dopamine function and the receptors that are responding to that dopamine are actually being upregulated and changed in the brain as a result of just eating food regularly that is not a healthy type of food, right? If we regularly expose animals to junk food, we end up with a changed brain. And that can be an issue because that change can actually be very long-lasting. And in animals, it seems that it lasts anywhere from years to a lifetime. Why that matters is that it explains that same change happens in drug addiction and explains why individuals relapse for years after they've gone sober. And that might be the same case for food, which is even more problematic because you can say no to drinking, you can say no to consuming certain drugs by keeping away from them. It's hard to say no to food because you need it to survive. It depends what foods you're saying no to that matters, but that makes it very a hard temptation to resist. Now, what I'm saying here, therefore, is that similar to drugs of abuse, the changes that we see in the brain as a result of over-consuming junk foods seem to match very well and have the same sort of pattern. Now, does that mean that we can talk about food addiction as a thing? That might be a reach because it says that foods are addictive, and that might not be true. Certain foods might be more addictive than others, in the same way that drugs are relatively addictive depending on how they're taken and which one it is. And so the question remains, what exactly should we do about it? If we have a part of our brain and system that becomes excessively responsive to certain foods and to their cues and generates this excessive unconscious desire, can we really do something about that? Are we just instead, at one point, stuck on an endless treadmill chasing that donut, or should I say that chocolat? Or is there actually something that we can do to try and increase our cognitive control and reduce the impact of those unconscious desires? And it seems like there is evidence to suggest that we can train our brain, that we can learn to delay gratification, that we can learn to make healthier choices. But maybe there's a way where we can just avoid being there in the first place. And that's really the challenge. And so I'm not here to tell you to not eat that first or second marshmallow. And I'm not here to tell you to not think about chocolat through the entire movie. What I want you to try and pay attention to, however, through the movie is how just the presentation of chocolate throughout is linked to this concept of desire, of problematic overconsumption, of unleashing some internal desires, and how those link between different types of abuse, whether it's food, drugs, or even in some cases sex. And so that's really what I want to leave you with, this understanding that we can tap into those parts of the brain and make them hyper-responsive, leaving problematic behaviors in their wake that could lead to bigger problems further down. And so with that, I want to thank you for paying attention and listening, and I'm happy to take questions. Thank you. Yes?
How
how can we make cognitive control take over more? It's a very good question. So there are a variety of tasks. Learning to delay gratification, as I mentioned, is one of the ways of doing that. And to cut through that jargon, what it is teaching ourselves to not respond to that impulse. The real problem is that we see these issues as unconscious desires in the sense that we are not really master of generating them. So it's going to be very hard to stop them from being generated. So if you get into a pattern where you feel like you're very responsive to food cues, or let's say you can't drive past a McDonald's without going, ooh, there's a McDonald's here. It's very hard to stop that from happening in the first place. Right? We don't have much control over that, but what we can do is to try and teach ourselves to say no repeatedly, admitting that to some degree a little bit of indulgence is actually fine. Right? We've got to be able to indulge once in a while. That's somewhat probably healthy. But it's the degree to which we indulge and what we indulge in and the pattern with which. What we know with regards to drugs, and it seems to be the same with food, it's how we consume them that actually might be dangerous. So it's binging on them that's going to be problematic. Regular small amounts of consumption might not be too bad. But if we start binging on a regular basis, as society sometimes inclines us to do, we can end up with bigger problems. Yes?
There's a lot of different kinds of sugar, and there's fruit sugar, and then there's from honey, maple syrup, so on and so forth, and then refined sugars. What's your take on all that?
It's a very good question. So I think sugar as a whole is going to be a problem, and I don't think it's the only culprit. I don't think there's an advent where there's the existence of sugar and fat in food that's never naturally existed before. Those two things are very separate and shouldn't exist. Now, they push us to overconsume whichever sugar it might be. What we do see, however, is that certain types of sugars like high fructose corn syrup as opposed to cane sugar, as opposed to, might actually change how our metabolism works to some degree. Now, there's still a lot of research trying to figure out how it changes our brain. Research on the food realms is divided into two camps, what I call neck up and neck down. Those who care about how physiology responds to certain types of foods, and there's evidence to suggest that something like high fructose corn syrup will change your metabolism and change how you adapt to a certain type of food and will actually increase craving. The same seems to be true for a lot of sweeteners. So as you might notice, less and less people are advertising or using sweeteners like Diet Coke and so on and so forth, because what that seems to do is that this idea of empty calories is not affecting directly the amount of calories you're taking in, but it's affecting how your brain responds to reward and seems to actually increase intake. So it drives the problems that we're highlighting here, which is that it makes you have bigger, longer lasting cravings for certain types of food. So that might be where the issue is. I think that frankly at the end of the day, we should, if we could, avoid anything that's had added sugar, because we have way more than enough of it in our diet as it is. And it's really not necessarily doing us any good. And I think more so for the younger generation. I'm the father of 2 young girls, and even then trying to tell them not to, indulge in sweets on a regular basis and explain to them that there's a good cognitive plan why they shouldn't. It turns out 5-year-olds and 3-year-olds don't listen. Who'd have known?
What about fruit?
And so that's a very good question. So part of the issue on top of that is how these sugars are taken in by the system. And so one argument is that whenever you start stripping foods from their normal content, whereas fruit normally has sugar and fiber in it, which actually slows and changes the way we metabolize and how we ingest it and so on and so forth. And that seems to be the problem. What we know about drug addiction that seems to overlap with sugar is that it's the high peaks are a problem. If you could get sugar into your system on a physiological level where you were maintaining a regular input and it was not sort of rocking your system too much, it might actually not be too bad. But it's when we start taking sweet drinks and beverages that are just water and sugar in some way or form, then we don't have anything to slow down that metabolism. Our insulin system has problems. Leptin, which is another hormone that's involved in regulating our fat stores, seem to have trouble adapting and regulating that and lead us to overconsume and lead to brain changes. So even if they initially have just changes on our gut and our metabolism down there, secondarily to that or thirdly to that, we then end up having changes in the brain that can be problematic.
general come with the same supply of the two hormones, leptin and ghrelin?
No, not at all.
Some people be leptin deprived,
Um,
turning off.
Well, so leptin is produced by fat cells, and so depending on the amount of fat you have in those cells, you're going to have greater amounts of leptin.
And leptin is manufactured?
It's manufactured by the fat cells, but travels up to the brain.
And ghrelin is manufactured in the stomach?
Yes, in the lower stomach, and is involved in like making you want to eat a particular meal. So the difference between those two, to some degree, is that ghrelin is what fluctuates up and down to make you say, it's lunchtime, it's dinner time, I should eat something, whether you are actually hungry or not, right? And that's where it's problematic when you have jet lag, right? Ghrelin is the one that tells you it's 2 a.m., you should have lunch now, if you're in a totally different time zone, right? Leptin is a very slow-acting kind of hormone. It's not trying to tell you eat now or stop eating now. It doesn't have much of an ability to tell you stop eating, and has an awful lot more ability to tell you, you need to eat, you're starving, you have no fat stores. Right? That's what it plays as a role. But it seems like it becomes insensitive when we have too many fat stores. So when obesity develops, leptin levels rise, but the brain's response to those leptin levels are just diminishing and dwindling away. So it's like there's no signal to say, you have enough fat stores, we're good. And so that's where the problem may lie.
In the research, do you see leptin being administered,
So,
are doctors and researchers considering?
So the real problem with regards to how our food system works internally is that because it's the most primary thing that's involved in our survival, there's multiple different loops. So if you take out one system, there's backups to make sure that you never stop eating. And that's why dieting is so difficult. Because if you stop one thing, then that system says, oh yeah, no, you should not eat. The other system says, like, but you're starving yourself. Don't you dare. And so leptin is going to come in and respond and say, you're starving yourself. But it won't say, you've got too much fat stores. We know that to some degree. There's a very small fraction, a couple of % of the population who suffers from obesity actually has a genetic disorder associated with leptin. And those few individuals can be given leptin, and it can dramatically change their weight gain. But it's a genetic background, and it only affects a very small percentage of the population. In most other people, leptin is through the roof with growing obesity, and there's not much you can do about it. If there was, some pharmaceutical would be pumping that drug out. Yes?
Does the microbiome play a role in the regulation of these pathways?
That's a very good question. So there's increasing amount of research, and I'm sure that's why you're asking the question, about the interest in the microbiome and how it's actually doing things. We've only just started accepting the idea that it's crucial for how we digest and how we deal with food. And it's starting to be more and more apparent that it then is affecting how our brain works. And it seems like that, let's just say that so far the research is still a little out as to whether it is doing exactly the same thing as what I'm telling you here, but that seems to be the inclination. It seems to be suggesting that understanding your microbiome and your gut microbiome and whether what's made of it can change how our brain responds to drugs and to food, and lead to a sensitized system which gives you excessive desire for unhealthy things. Yes?
How about the percentage of cocoa in chocolate? Does that have a big effect?
I would say that secondarily, because the more cocoa you have in chocolate, the less likely you've got sugar in there. So high levels of cocoa means less sugar, and that's probably a good thing. But it's also probably why most people won't eat 90% cocoa chocolate very regularly, and you can't convince a 5-year-old to do it, it turns out. I tried. So yes, to some degree, I think it's more just directly the amount of sugar and fat that's going to be in the chocolate that's going to be the bigger determinant about how you respond. I think cocoa probably has some quite healthy properties in itself, so eating a decent amount of it is actually not that bad. Yes?
What is your opinion on ingesting probiotics in capsule forms or live forms? I mean, are you researching that area?
So
It's a real trend now, and you go into Whole Foods and there's a whole refrigerator of refrigerated pro and prebiotics, and what do you do?
Yes. So my research, my lab focuses on neck up, mostly, and so not so much on probiotics. I have a lot of friends who are starting to do that kind of research, and that's because it's following with the overall trend. I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with that. I would argue that for millennia we've had good gut microbiomes, and maybe the better way would be to try and understand why that changed and try and reverse that rather than just trying to supplement a problem, if you see what I mean. I'd be tempted to say that gut microbiome came from somewhere, and that's likely what we're eating and how we're eating. And so as we eat foods that don't have any of the nutrients or don't have any bacteria in them because they want to have the longest shelf life possible, then we have that issue. The same reason, you know, I can remember coming to the US for the first time, in case some of you hadn't noticed that I'm not from here. Just putting it out there. And I was shocked that milk could last 3 weeks. That seemed, I was like, but it can't be milk. Because to me, it should only last, you know, 5 days max. But frankly, it should even last less than that. But that suggests that whatever would make it go off is no longer there. And triple pasteurization and so on and so forth is killing bacteria. And that's how it lasts. And so if we kill bacteria in every food that we eat, sure, it has fiber, it has sugar, it has fat and those nutrients, but it's carrying something else. And I think what we're missing is, instead of getting a supplement to fill the void, we should try and figure out a way to get back to the foods that might just provide that naturally. Yes?
Does dopamine cross the blood-brain barrier, and what are the peripheral levels? So if it does cross the blood-brain, a common medicine used in cardiology is dopamine, and I've never heard of it having an effect on the brain. You get very high levels in the blood.
Of dopamine?
Yeah, dopamine is a very common cardiac medicine. We use it all the time.
Right. Well, so, no, it definitely has impacts on the brain and is quite crucial. One of the best examples would be with Parkinson's patients who are taking levodopa, or some...
Has this much effect.
Right, but it affects our motor function, and some of that motor function is being controlled by the brain as opposed to just purely peripherally. But what we see is that taking those sort of dopamine boosting drugs can have a great impact for treating Parkinson's, but the interesting part is that a small proportion of Parkinson's patients develop something called DDS, which is dopamine dysregulation syndrome, and those individuals end up developing addictive-like behaviors, such as compulsive gambling.
You're focusing on the small people.
I agreed.
There seems to be a big dissociation.
Yes, and the reality seems to be underlying that is that what I'm presenting to you here would, if it was a one-size-fits-all, would argue that every one of us that's had something that we would call junk food should now have a food-related problem, and that's clearly not the case. And so there's individual differences that are quite large, and that's where research is going in trying to understand what makes one individual respond to those drugs, those foods, and their brain change in that way, and why some others don't. And that seems to be the case, and that might be explaining why some Parkinson's patients react absolutely fine to dopamine agents, and some develop a problem with them. In the same way that I'm assuming most of you in the room have had alcohol before and don't necessarily have a problem with it, right? And it's a very addictive drug. And yet that suggests more so that, you know, although we can get at some of the functioning of the brain that might be underlying that, there's going to be something that's more specific to certain individuals that might predispose to a response to that. And that's what we saw with animals that were predisposed to obesity. Their brain seems to be responding to food in a different way in the first place.
But it seems like it's the locally released dopamine from the local receptors that are much more important than the peripheral receptors.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. Yes.
How much would you say is binging or overconsumption due to social conditioning or ghrelin?
Or the last part?
The ghrelin.
Ghrelin, sorry, yes. So it's a good question. I would say that overconsumption is, I don't think most of it's necessarily driven by ghrelin per se, but, and this, with all those problems, there's definitely a social construct that's driving that. But again, because it seems like some individuals seem to have more of a problem than others, I would suggest that there's something with regards to our response to those types of foods that predispose us to that. And for example, what we know is that unfortunately, stress or regular stresses also change the dopaminergic system. And that's why childhood abuse or some kind of history of trauma can predispose someone to drug addiction, but can also predispose them to eating disorders. And so that, more likely than not, that seems to be potentially the problem.